Okay, starting lesson 2, elements of research. Um, in this lesson, we're going to kind of unpack a lot of foundational concepts in related to the research process. So this is an important lecture, or lesson, I should say. It's going to be a little bit longer. This is actually the longest lesson of the term. The next two after this are really short. Um, I'm probably going to divide this one up into several parts because I'm noticing that I'm having some difficulty uploading lectures online. It's taking like hours to upload a single lecture, so I'm probably going to try to do these in shorter spurts. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about are concepts. Concepts are important to the research process, particularly for us in the social sciences and in mass communication research, because as I said, we're not working with physical properties for the most part, right? We're not measuring chemical levels and things like that. We're measuring ideas for the most part, concepts. So a concept is a term that expresses an abstract idea by generalizing from particulars and summarizing related observations. So what you do in the social sciences is you see something happening, and you try to you essentially you categorize it, you give it a name, and then that allows you to measure it. Remember, we talked about measurement last time, and you can't measure things you can't measure things if they're so abstract that you don't even know what you're talking about. So we kind of give labels to things, and these are the concepts. So, for example, somebody saw what was happening with agenda setting. I talked about this last time with McCombs and Shaw, those researchers that came up with agenda setting theory. And they labeled it. They said, okay, we're going to call this agenda setting. You might see a child who watches TV all the time, and whenever you turn the TV off, he throws a fit. He gets really upset when you turn the TV off, and he doesn't play very well, right, with other kids when he's not watching TV. And you might look at that, all these different things that are happening, all these different actions and reactions, and you might label that television dependence. That's a concept. Now we can actually work with that. We can measure television dependence if we operationalize it, and we'll talk about operationalization. But before we do that, operationalization will be a little bit later in this lesson, and we talked about it a little bit last time as well. But constructs are also important in some cases, right? I mean, at this level, when you guys are doing your research projects, you're probably not going to develop any constructs, but I want you to be aware of what this is, because you might read about a construct in one of the papers that you read for this class when you're doing your literature review or your article review assignment. And a construct is just a combination of concepts. It's really abstract, so it can't be observed directly, and they have no meaning outside of the research project. So the best way to explain this is with an example. There's a construct that we work with in our field, specifically in the researchers that work with advertising. It's called advertising involvement. And advertising involvement refers to three separate concepts: attention, interest, and arousal. So when researchers they can see and identify attention. People pay attention to advertisements, which is different from people actually being interested in the advertisements, which is different from people actually being aroused, excited by a particular advertisement or set of advertisements. So all of these things can combine to form this construct. This is just something, again, it makes no sense outside of the research. This is just something that researchers came up with. They said, you know what? Attention, interest, and arousal are part of the same basic construct, and they called it advertising involvement. Okay? So we can now do studies to measure advertising involvement by measuring advertising attention on the one hand, interest on the other hand, and arousal on the other hand. So, and here's another example of a construct. Authoritarianism is actually a construct that combines 9 different concepts, including submission, superstition, lack of freedom, and other concepts. Again, you can't see authoritarianism, you can't grapple with it, but you can measure it through a questionnaire, for example. You can identify it if you know through by examining some of these concepts, right? That are kind of subsumed by authoritarianism. More importantly, I mean, don't get too obsessed with the constructs, because I want you to just sort of understand it, because you might read it somewhere. But you're not gonna develop any constructs necessarily in this class, right? But this is important. Variables are very, very important to the research process, and you will work directly with variables. Okay, variables are the things that we measure directly in research. And a variable is literally just something that varies. And if you want a definition that's maybe more straightforward, Baxter and Babby on page 49, they say it's a variable. Variables are features or characteristics about individuals or phenomena. Again, these are the things that we measure in research, and that's the important part. And I'm going to give you a bunch of examples here. One of the variables that we work with in our field pretty extensively is gender. Gender is a variable. Remember, what's a variable? A gender is a feature or characteristic about an individual or phenomenon, right? So gender is certainly a feature or characteristic about an individual or a phenomenon. Gender also varies. Someone could be a male, somebody could be a female, and it's something that we absolutely can measure. And this is something you've all seen. This is why this is a good example, because you've all filled out surveys. Somebody was doing research, and you were a subject in their research, and you had to answer a question about your gender. It asked you, are you male or female? You've probably done this hundreds of times, right? And so that's something that somebody's interested in measuring. That's a variable. Another common variable in our field is really more common in sociology, but we do work with this sometimes. Occupation. Are you a journalist? Are you a lawyer? Are you a janitor? Are you a doctor? Are you a sales rep? Occupation is something that varies. It's something that we might be interested in measuring in a research project. Social class, upper, middle, and lower. Newspaper type. This is a variable from one of my research studies on Egypt. I looked at government newspapers, independent newspapers, and opposition party-owned newspapers. So there were 3 different newspaper types, right? Loyalty to the government. Very loyal, somewhat loyal, disloyal. You might look to categorize news organizations by their loyalty to the government. And we'll see many, many examples of variables throughout the semester, but I hope that that's clear. A variable is something that varies and that we're interested in measuring as a part of a research project, okay? Note also that these variables represent, quote, logical groupings of attributes, right? So, social class, occupation, gender. You look at the level, we call these levels of the male and the female. Those are the levels of the variable. Journalist, lawyer, doctor, those are levels of the variable occupation. But notice that journalist, lawyer, doctor, janitor, salesperson, whatever, they represent a logical grouping, right? They represent a logical grouping. So that's what you're going to see with all the variables that we work with in this class. They're always going to represent logical groupings of attributes. They're always going to be things that vary, right? It's never just a constant. It's always something that's variable, and it's something that we can measure and do measure as part of our research. Now, specifically when we set up a research study, we don't just deal with variables in general. We deal with independent and dependent variables, and this will become clear for you why this is important. But independent and dependent variables are essentially at their core about causality. Does one thing cause something else? Does something influence something else? And specifically, the independent variable is that which influences. This is why sometimes people call it the influencing variable. The dependent variable is the one that is influenced. It is dependent upon the independent variable, right? In research, the researcher varies the independent variable, okay, systematically, right, with different levels, and then seeks to measure the dependent variable. That's the thing that we want to explain. Now, this is probably not totally clear in your minds. Let me give you an example. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's say we wanted to study the effects of sleep deprivation on driving performance. We might hypothesize, remember that word, hypothesis? We might hypothesize that people that are sleep deprived perform poorly in driving, that they don't drive very well, they don't drive effectively when they're lacking sleep, right? We might hypothesize that. That seems like it's a pretty reasonable hypothesis. Now I want you to think for a second before I answer this question for you, because I mean, if we were in class, I would just ask this question and then have you guys answer, but we can't do that because we're on video. So try to think about this before you answer. What in this particular scenario, in this example, the effects of sleep deprivation on driving performance, what is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable? Think about that for a minute. See if you know the answer. Before you can come up with the independent and the dependent variable, you have to identify the two variables. Can you do that? Can you identify in this particular scenario the effects of sleep deprivation on driving performance, or in the hypothesis statement, sleep deprivation has a negative effect on driving performance? That might be the way that I formally state that hypothesis. Sleep deprivation negatively affects driving performance. In that statement, there are two variables. Can you identify before you put them into dependent and independent, can you identify the two variables? The two variables are sleep deprivation on the one hand and driving performance on the other hand. These are two things that vary and that we're interested in measuring. And we can also think of logical groupings of attributes, right, that would be categorized under these variables, couldn't we? Like driving performance, there could be good driving performance, bad driving performance, right? Moderately effective driving performance, whatever. With sleep deprivation, there could be different levels. There could be somebody could be well rested, somebody could be completely sleep deprived, and somebody could be somewhere in the middle, right? We could have different levels. So these are variables. Now think about which one is the dependent and which one is the independent variable. Which one influences the other? Which one are we saying influences the other? Think about it for a minute. Well, what we're saying is sleep deprivation influences or might influence, we don't know, we still have to do the study, right? Sleep deprivation might influence driving performance. So in this example, sleep deprivation is the independent variable, and driving performance is the dependent variable. Okay? So I'm going to give you more examples, but I want you to be thinking about this. You have to get, by the time we take our exam, and then later on for the projects, you have to get automatic with this. You have to be able to look at a research scenario, like a hypothesis statement or a research question or whatever, and then identify the dependent and the independent variables. So, and we work with independent and dependent variables all the time. We work with them in surveys, we work with them in experiments, and even in content analysis. So really most quantitative research, we're working with independent and dependent variables. And I want to note this is important. Even though we're talking about causality here, causality is very difficult to demonstrate. It's very difficult to say this causes this. In our daily lives, we talk about causality very casually, don't we? And that's wrong. We'll say things like, the reason my team is so bad is because of the coach. We say that all the time, don't we? Do you really know that? Have you been able to study that systematically, isolating all of the different variables? No. You think that that's what happens, or you think that that's why your team is bad, because of the coach. But then what happens? Sometimes they fire the coach, and then what? The team still stinks, right? That happened. A couple years ago, it happened with my favorite football team, the Minnesota Vikings. We had a coach, Brad Childress. Everybody said this guy stinks, and that's why we stink. And then they hired another coach, Leslie Frazier, and the team still, for the most part, still stunk. And they fired him, and now they have a new coach. And if they don't do well this year, they'll be saying the same thing. They'll be saying the reason we stink is because of the coach. But really, it's a lot deeper than that. I mean, it's about the players on your team. That's another variable. The talent level, injuries, the ownership, the general manager. I mean, all these things play a role in whether or not your team wins. It's not just the coach. Now, sometimes it might be the coach, but the point is we have to study this stuff systematically. It's difficult to talk about causality or to demonstrate causality. And specifically, there are 3 conditions that must be met in order to say this causes this. Time order, a logical relationship between variables, and you have to rule out confounding variables. So let me take those in turn. So first of all, time order. You have to demonstrate that the cause precedes the effect. You have to be able to show that whatever you're saying is causing the effect, you have to show that it came first. Okay? There has to be a logical relationship between variables. It has to make some sense. I mean, it can't just be like preposterous. Like, I'm trying to think of something completely absurd. Now I'm struggling to come up with an example. So this is okay. So some people will say things like, if you eat this particular kind of food, you're gonna get the flu or something like that. There are all these theories that people have about sickness. How you catch a cold, and like this is a good one. If it's cold, you're gonna catch a cold. That's what a lot of people think, right? That's pretty ridiculous. Colds are viruses. They're caused by, they're airborne viruses. And so you get a virus by contracting it from someone else, right? It's spread through germs, through the air, whatever, touching someone or something, right? You don't get a cold because it's a little bit chilly outside, right? And that really, if you talk to a doctor, that doesn't really make a lot of sense when people say that. So there has to be a logical relationship between the variables, a logical causal relationship. Like it has to make sense that this could possibly cause this, right? Like people have all these weird superstitions, like I'm trying to think here, like if I isn't it there's something with a black cat, like if a black cat crosses in front of me, I'm going to have a bad day or something like that. It's going to be bad luck. That's ridiculous. It's just a superstition. The Friday the 13th stuff, and, trying to think of other superstitions. But the point is, if something bad happens to you after a black cat crossed your path, that's just because something bad was going to happen to you anyways. It has nothing to do with the black cat, right? So there has to be a logical relationship between the variables. If you're going to say this causes this, A causes B, it has to make sense. And then thirdly, and this is probably the trickiest part, you have to be able to eliminate all of the confounding variables. You have to be able to eliminate all of the other potential causes of that effect. Do you understand? So to go back to the football example, if you say that the reason my team stinks is because of the coach, you have to be able to eliminate all of the other confounding variables. That is, you have to be able to rule out all of the other possible causes of your team stinking. Okay, players, no, you have to. Nope, we have enough talent. We haven't had injuries. And go right down through the list of other things that might cause your team to be not very good. Effort. Is the team trying? Right? So, if you can eliminate all of the confounding variables and you demonstrate a logical relationship and you demonstrate time order, then you can say A causes B. Okay? I'll give you an example really quickly. If you look at, this is a real example that's actually in one of the books. It's a prominent example. There is a relationship. There is a correlation. And this is why it's also important to differentiate between a correlation and a causal correlation, or a relationship and a causal relationship. Because there are all kinds of relationships out there. Relationships between variables. Two variables might be related, but they're not necessarily causally related. So let me explain. Let me give you this example. When ice cream cone consumption increases, deaths by drowning also increase. This is a real example. I'm not making it up. This is true. As ice cream cone consumption increases, deaths by drowning also increase. So that is a correlation. There is a relationship there between these two variables. We call this a positive correlation because as one goes up, the other goes up. That's a positive correlation. That's real. I'm not making this up. Okay. We can demonstrate time order. Ice cream cones increase first. The consumption of ice cream cones increases, and then deaths by drowning happen. So we can actually demonstrate time order. Now we don't. Now we have two problems here. First of all, we don't have a logical relationship. This makes no sense. So this is why I'm saying you have to meet all three conditions for you to be able to say A causes B. Obviously, eating ice cream cones does not lead to deaths by drowning. That does not make any sense. There's no logical relationship between these variables, right? There's no logical causal relationship. And we certainly have not been able to eliminate confounding variables. Can anybody think of the key confounding variable in this particular case? See if you can come up with the key confounding variable in this case. There is a confounding variable that if you were to say, yeah, eating ice cream, because some people would do this if they're not well versed in research, they would look at the data and they would go, oh my God, I have to stop eating ice cream cones because this is risky business. I could drown, right? Just looking at the data. But there's a confounding variable here. In other words, there's another cause. There's another cause. That's another variable that's actually causing both the increased consumption of ice cream cones and the deaths by drowning. And the confounding variable is the weather. The weather. When the weather gets hot, people eat ice cream cones. And then when the weather gets hot, people go swimming and some people tragically drown. Okay? So the confounding variable there is weather. So if you don't have a good understanding of confounding variables, you're gonna make all kinds of causal claims that are completely invalid, right? So those are the three criteria for causality. I'm going to stop here because, again, I don't want to go too long, and we'll pick this up in part 2.